All right. Good morning, everyone. Glad you could join us for a little session halftime update. Probably not really halftime. We're, I think, a little past that. Think of it more as seventh inning stretch, the period in between the second and third period of a hockey game, something like that. So we're closing in on the end of session here, and thought it'd be a good time for to get everyone together and give you a little bit of a taste of kind of where things stand and what we're expecting here going forward. So again, glad you're here. Let's jump right in. First off, if you do have any questions, use the Q&A function for questions, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can here towards the end. And then also, too, as you all know, you can always get in touch with us here at the CGMC if you have want to dig deeper into any of these issues. We definitely are available for that. So going into session here, our priorities from the CGMC perspective were pretty simple, pretty straightforward. First off, to shore up our fragile EMS system. Secondly, to secure passage of a bonding bill that invests in key infrastructure around the state, things like water and wastewater and roads and those sorts of things that we all rely on. And then finally, to pump the brakes on new policy. As we all know, last year the legislature put quite a bit on the plate of local government to absorb and figure out going forward. And so our message to the legislature was, let's not add anything new. Let's focus on implementation and making sure that the things that were given to us last year as tasks are workable, and that we've got time to move through them before you add new ideas to our agendas going forward. And we'll see how that has or has not been successful on the part of the legislature. So starting with EMS, our immediate goal is passage of $120 million for emergency aid for ambulances around the state, so that we can keep these services operating through next year. There is, of course, a lot of need across the state in terms of financing to prop up our ambulance system. And so very much we are looking at emergency aid as being a primary objective. Our belief is the state has the money, they've got the reserves, they've got the surplus, they can do this if they want to. So where do we stand? So we spent quite a bit of time right before session and in the early part of session building a coalition, and you can see all of those members there. It's local government organizations, it's the hospitals, it's individual providers across the state. So we really have a very robust coalition of supporters focused on making sure that we can get that emergency aid for our ambulance providers. We also have very strong bipartisan support. Really, we've not talked to anybody, Republican, Democrat, rural, metro, who at least doesn't recognize that the financing issues faced by our providers are very important, and that we need to infuse some money into the system. We do have two pieces of legislation introduced. Representative Liz Lagarde is carrying our legislation in the House, and Senator Houschild is carrying it in the Senate. We've had great hearings so far in the House Health and Human Services and Taxes Committee, and then also in Senate Taxes. So we're going through the process. There's been a lot of discussion and deliberation, and I think we're at least from a technical standpoint in good shape, but we still have to get the politics of it all right. And part of the problem on the politics side is the governor and the DFL leaders that set budget targets about a month ago set targets that are really inadequate. They're only putting $10 million into an aid program, and then about $6 million into reforming the regulatory board, and then some other pilot programs. So lots of work to do there. It is problematic, kind of the low floor that the governor and DFL leaders have set. And this chart here actually is one of my favorite things that we've done here recently. And basically what it shows is the distribution difference between what the governor and DFL leaders are proposing versus what the big coalition bill is. And so there you see money flowing throughout the state, all across the 8 EMSRB regions. The governor's proposal, because of the way they structure it, would actually only get money to the Northeast and Central Minnesota EMS regions, which is very problematic, because you could be individual community who has a lot of need and be in the West Central district. And you could have a community that has the same amount of need in the Central district. They're getting funded, the West Centrals are not. And so it very much ends up picking winners or losers just by virtue of the fact that they're distributing such little money in such a sort of awkward way. So we're continuing to work on this. Our approach is statewide. It covers everybody, and it meets more of the needs that are out there. So to move things forward, last week rather, we put out an action alert to all of our cities, urging you to contact your legislative leaders, the governor's office on the EMS issue. If you've not already, please do so. And even if you're not a city that has a license for ambulance service, it's still important that you weigh in, as these ambulance services regionally support each other, need to have the resources to support each other. And even, the system that does cover you may be underfunded as well. So definitely weigh in on the action alert. Lots of work to be done here going forward. And so we need very much your voices in the discussion. And I think you'll see some more activity on this week even. The potential end game, as things come together at the legislature, think of last year and the example of the Republicans leveraging votes for the bonding bill for additional nursing home funding. And that was the deal that brought together the bonding bill and the end of session in 2023. And I think the way that it is setting up, and a lot of the way that people are actually talking about things, is that something very similar could potentially happen with EMS. And so that's where we're at right now on EMS. And so with that, I'm going to flip it over to Liz to talk about bonding.
Thank you, Bradley. This is or should be a bonding year, and we have a number of asks that we are trying to push forward at the legislature, as well as trying to ensure that we are getting funding on these grant programs. Not surprisingly, these are all grant programs that would benefit members across the state. The first, and probably the most important, is the Public Facilities Authority. If you are doing a wastewater or drinking water project, it's going to be hard to get done without money from the PFA. We are seeking $299 million, which is a big ask, but really reflects what the need is out there. We are asking for most of that to be put into the two major grant programs, the Point Source Implementation Grant Program, as well as the Water Infrastructure Program. But there's also $39 million state matching funds for the federal funds, and that will help keep the drinking water revolving loan fund and this clean water revolving loan fund moving. In addition to that, we also continue to place an important priority on the Public Facilities Authority lead line replacement program. That was something we helped establish last year. And although a big chunk of money was put into it, to meet the state and federal goals of removing all lead lines within a decade, we need more money into that program, and it needs to be continually happening. So we're also asking for money for that. With both of those, we continue to work with our partners of the two trade unions and in Conservation Minnesota, as well as St. Paul Regional Water Service. The other three programs, all grant programs that really help us on the economic development side. First is the Child Care Facilities Grant Program, Housing Public Infrastructure Grant Program, and the BDPI program, all help building the infrastructure that we need for childcare, housing, and BDP, and for building out more businesses. Now, we are also making some significant policy changes for the PFA that would raise the cap on the two grant programs. These are the WIF program, the Water Infrastructure Fund, and the Point Source Implementation Grant Program are extremely important to getting drinking water and wastewater projects done, but the caps on these programs have not kept up with inflation. We've been pushing for the last couple of years to move this forward. We're hoping this year is the time to get it over the finish line. These bills were heard in both the Senate and Jobs Committee, and we've made great progress in the Senate, where it was included in their omnibus jobs bill, which passed off the floor last week. The House has not unveiled their jobs bill yet. It happens, we're probably going to see it later today or tomorrow, but we're hoping that they take this from the Senate and move it forward. It would be, I think, a huge victory for a lot of our cities who are seeing projects move forward in the next year or two. With respect to the governor's bonding bill, this came out in January, and it was just under 989 million or billion dollar, was just under $1 billion, with mostly GO funds and funding from other sources. It was very, very heavy on state-owned assets. A lot of people complained that there was too little set aside for local projects. Now, the debt capacity was increased after the February forecast came out. That does leave more space for local projects. And it's also, there's some potential that there could be cash for some of these projects as well. Now, the House and Senate have been holding hearings. The House has been doing on individual bonding bills, and the House and Senate has been hearing bills on agency priorities as well as some policy issues. We do anticipate that legislators will increase the amount available for local projects, but the focus will still be on what they call traditional infrastructure. And that's things like, wastewater, drinking water, just the basic infrastructure that is needed for communities to function. We have not seen any bills unveiled yet. We anticipate that'll happen in the next couple of weeks. The House is just wrapping up the hearings it's doing. So probably by the end of April, we should see the first version of a bonding bill. The next portion the next topic we want to talk about is the housing bills. The missing middle bill that you've heard a lot about appears to be dead for this legislative session. The original version of this bill would have required cities to allow up to 8 plexes on land zoned for single-family housing. The bill would have also required cities to allow accessory dwelling units by right on most residential zoned properties. It also included restrictions on design standard and parking requirements. This bill, it came out with a big splash, a lot of advocates on all sides of the issues pushing it forward, but they really had forgotten to include local governments in the conversation. And it saw a lot of objections from the suburbs, from greater Minnesota. It really collapsed in on its own weight. We expect it might appear again next year, but it is dead for now. One portion of the bills that may move forward is the multifamily housing in commercial areas. Now that they did narrow this bill as well, the restrictions on parking minimums will now only apply to light rail and bus rapid transit stops, which means it would not apply at all in greater Minnesota. They've also tried to ease the burden of losing commercial property and the accompanying sort of property tax benefits by requiring that existing commercial property would have to be replaced with mixed use. Probably the most problematic aspects of this bill, aside from taking away zoning authority, is that it would also include some administrative review provisions that we think will make it harder to actually get housing done. Now, the House State and Local Government Committee heard this on Friday, and they passed an amended version of the bill. The 4 of the city groups, including the CGMC, testified against the bill. It did pass out. It's sitting on the House, the register to be heard on the floor, but it's not clear if there are enough votes to move it forward. The initial versions of some of these bills did have GOP support, but due to the changes, the GOP no longer supports it. The Senate has not announced its plans. I am guessing that they are probably watching to see what happens in the House. But the likelihood of whether or not they're going to be able to move it off the floor is even more uncertain. Again, with losing the GOP support and a 1-vote margin, it will be a lot harder to get done in the Senate. We are interested in hearing your thoughts on the latest version. And, as this moves forward, it's always important from us to hear, where you're at on it. So if you do have any input, please do email me with that. And I'd like to, hear what you have to say about it.
All right. Thank you, Liz. Going to now talk about a couple of other items that we are tracking on behalf of CGMC. So a couple of things here. Local sales taxes. I'm going to talk a little bit about those. TIF and prevailing wage, a replacement fund bill for bonding projects, and then just generally the impulse by some in the legislature, especially from the Metro, to just mess around with the Public Facilities Authority formulas and how things are funded. So starting with local sales taxes, as you all know, there's currently a moratorium in place through the end of 2025. Last session, the legislature created the local sales task force during the interim. And so that group was convened by the Department of Revenue, brought together some stakeholders, including city and county officials. CGMC monitored all of those hearings, testified, provided written comments, weighed in as they did all of their deliberations, really over probably about 3 months of work. The task force recommended a process to allow cities to impose local sales taxes without approval from the legislature. This is something that we've been pressing for because of the inability of the legislature to really figure it out, to get them out of the business, put some guardrails around what cities can do, and let us move forward. And so that was the gist of the report that came out from that group here earlier this year. This House and the Senate now have both kind of looked at the report and ingested the feedback of the task force and have unveiled their versions of the bill, which are different. And so there's going to be, I think, a ways to go here. In the House, they're taking a much more restrictive approach to local sales taxes. And historically, they've been the body that has taken a more skeptical view of local sales taxes. So there was a hearing last Thursday in the tax committee. It allows for some project types to be authorized locally. And so things like sporting facilities, convention centers, libraries, all of those, you would be able to, under certain circumstances, after proving up certain elements of regionality, be able to authorize locally. In both cases, whether or not you're going the local authorization route, or if your project doesn't qualify and you would need to go to the legislature, it does require resolutions of support from neighboring local governments to show regionality. And the bar is different depending on which avenue you're taking. It also creates an equalization fund for distribution to cities and counties without a sales tax. And so essentially, it's going to add 15% to the cost of the tax that then goes into a state fund that then flows out to local governments without a local sales tax going forward. So it will create some unnecessary costs related to your project. In the Senate, it does allow for more project types to be authorized locally in comparison to the House. There's also fewer requirements for imposing a tax locally or through the legislature. It does have a version of the equalization fund, but it puts it much more on you as the city to come up with a plan for local revenue sharing, and doesn't otherwise put a lot of restrictions around there. Money doesn't flow to the state and then flow back out, or that sort of thing. So a different approach for sure in the Senate. They do have a hearing tomorrow morning in the Senate Tax Committee. And my suspicion as we go forward here is that we'll probably end up aligning much more with the Senate version of the way forward versus the House version. But otherwise, regardless, there still is a long ways to go forward on these bills before I think they become law in any way and we get the moratorium lifted on local sales taxes. TIF and prevailing wage. So this came up just very recently. Started to get a lot of feedback or a lot of contact from our cities on a labor proposal that would apply prevailing wage requirements to TIF projects. They're really targeting and focusing on multifamily construction. And the goal from the perspective of the labor unions is to prevent wage theft and worker exploitation. There are a lot of horror stories, frankly, out there in terms of developers not acting in good faith when it comes to their employees, misclassifying employees, et cetera. And so the idea from the labor folks is that if developers and contractors have to go through the prevailing wage process with all of its transparency and reporting, that would be a deterrent to the bad actors out there in the industry. Of course, from our perspective, we do have concerns that this adds cost to getting projects done, especially in housing, and that we're trying to figure out a way forward here. So we have actually been working with and negotiating with the trades. We met with them last week, actually, to ensure that necessary housing projects in greater Minnesota are able to be financed and move forward. So we are very actively engaged, kind of behind closed doors in discussion with them. We'll see where it goes. We'll see what we're able to get in terms of accommodations and whether or not something ultimately goes through the legislature. So that is very much a work in progress. And so with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Liz now to talk about the Local Government Replacement Fund.
Thank you, Bradley. This bill sprung up this year kind of without warning, and it's in both the House and Senate, authored by both the Senate and House bonding chairs. And basically, the proposal would require that any local government that is receiving bonding funds, whether that's a direct appropriation or through a grant program like the PFA, that local government would be required to create a dedicated replacement fund. When I say dedicated replacement fund, it is dedicated to that specific asset. It's not a replacement fund that you could kind of, plug and play to different, portions of your capital asset portfolio. There are some challenges with this fund. The state would control the amount that you need to put in the fund, how it is used. And we really think that this would be unworkable for a lot of our cities who are currently fiscally responsible. Now, the Senate and House versions differ a little bit. My understanding that the Senate chair seems to think that it should be aimed only at water projects. The House chair wants to apply it to all bonding projects. Either way, we think this bill would be problematic for a lot of our cities, and that our cities can better their money, manage their money, and dealing with the long-term infrastructure needs in their cities than the state can. So what we want you to do is, make sure that all of your legislators know that cities should have the authority to manage their own funds, and that they should oppose these bills becoming part of the overall bonding package. Really could create some long-term problems for our cities. Then next slide. Thank you. I used to refer to annexation bills as my Groundhog Day. This bill has become my Groundhog Day. And by that, I mean, it seems to be popping up every single year. Have to spend a lot of time pushing back on it because of the implications that it could have for greater Minnesota. This bill, HF 4303, there's also a Senate companion, but it's really the House we're focusing on, sort of derives from the idea that some legislators have that too much of the Public Facility Authority funding, it's the wastewater and drinking water money, that too much of it goes to greater Minnesota. And so these bills have been introduced that would basically decimate both the loan and grant programs. They would change the criteria for affordability that currently focuses on, like when you build a project, what impact is it going to have on your rates, takes away those criteria and looks at whether or not you sort of meet certain environmental justice considerations. The changes to the program would really have long-term implications for the grant and loan programs, because it would be funneling a lot of money to places that don't need it, and really collapsing the programs in on themselves. Now, we had hoped it wasn't going to even get heard this year, but about 2 weeks ago, we received notice at 1 p.m. on a Tuesday that the bill was going to be heard the following morning in the Jobs Committee. We stepped up, alerted the troops, got the league on board to help us, contacted the MPCA, the governor's office, the PFA. Everybody was there ready to go at the hearing to push back on this legislation, but it literally got pulled at the last minute during the committee. It appears dead for now, but this seems to be a priority for the House bonding chair. So it may pop up as an amendment, and we will continue to push back on it because we think that the long-term viability of the PFA programs is really, really important to the long-term viability of, water projects in greater Minnesota. So we'll keep pushing back on it, hope that nothing happens with it.
So kind of conclusion before we move on to some questions. Okay, there we go. So to conclude, as we move into the last phase of session here, the legislature is moving into omnibus bill and conference committee season. So they'll be spending a lot more time on the floor and in conference committees, and the general standing committees will have kind of wrapped up most of their work. There's still time for things to come together on bonding and EMS, but the clock is ticking. The legislature must be done by the constitutional deadline of May 20th. And they are going to be taking some time off here next week for the Passover break. And so they've got to get moving, but there is time to get some things together. Pass a bonding bill, take care of EMS, hopefully not do any of the other stuff that is problematic. So as we move forward here, definitely read the CGMC in brief for weekly updates. That comes out every Thursday, and generally is probably your best way to continue to follow the action in terms of what's happening at the legislature. Follow the CGMC on X or Twitter or whatever we call it now, at Greater MN Cities. That also is a good way to kind of follow even more so in real time some of things that are happening. And then also watch your email for action alerts, because again, we're definitely getting to that season where it'll be important for the legislature to hear from our cities and our members on issues that are important. And so I would anticipate that we'll be sending out some action alerts here on any number of topics as we go forward and before the end of session. So with that, want to also invite you to a couple of upcoming events. We've got our LMC breakfast at the League conference there, June 27th. Our summer conference in July 24th through the 26th in Waite Park and St. Joseph. And right immediately after the end of this webinar, an email with link to register will be going out. So you can just stay right on your computer. You can open your email. You can register for the summer conference. I think it's going to be a good one. It's going to be interesting. The cities of Waite Park and St. Joe have really been working hard to put on a good conference and a lot of interesting things for our members to see and do. And then, of course, we'll have our fall conference here in November as we get ready for the next legislative session and we unpack the November election. So with that, want to take any questions, use the Q&A function. Looks like we might have one or two here. A question on a news report on the radio this morning said there is a possibility of a special session to allow for state action on Minneapolis efforts to regulate Uber, Lyft and make these statewide. Is that going to happen? That's a good question. You know, I think that's one of the issues that I think here as we get towards the end of session is going to potentially complicate discussions because you do, I think, have a number of DFL legislators who feel very strongly on this issue and want a certain outcome. And that could be one of the wrenches that gets in the way of session ending. Whether or not there's a special session, I'm not sure. I'd hope that the legislature could just get things done and go home. But if there is a special session, that may mean that they are trying to avoid it getting in the way of other things such as EMS or a bonding bill. Other questions here? All right. If the legislature is moving to a policy that all bonding awards being mandated to create replacement funds, is the state attempting to almost eliminate grants funding and bonding in the long run? You know, my quick answer on that, our belief is, you know, they are trying to make it difficult on cities, no question about it. And I think it all goes back to, you know, Liz's comment that the impulse for a lot of these pieces of legislation is a feeling among some legislators in the metro that too much money is going to Greater Minnesota. And so, yeah, it does feel like they are trying to put more barriers up for cities. But it is interesting in that it's a pretty commonly held belief that cities at the legislature, that cities should be doing more to plan for the long-term upgrade and maintenance of their facilities. And so it's, I think, an issue that comes out of an impulse that is fine in terms of taking care of our assets, but the way that they're going about it and the impact that it could have, I think, is potentially pretty detrimental. Any other questions or comments? Well, as always, you can stay in touch with us here at CGMC. There's contact Liz and my contact information. And we look forward to hearing from you. There's one last question that we're going to get. Let's slide right in. The question is, with local road improvement grants, the $1.5 million max granted threshold was vastly exceeded for projects that were, quote, legislatively directed. This limits funds for the rest of us. That's more of a comment, not so much a question, but the response would be, yes, it does. No argument here. With that insight on transportation funding, again, very much thank you for being here, joining us today. Again, reach out if you have any questions, and do watch Twitter, X, your emails for more information from CGMC. Have a great day and a great rest of April. We'll see you all very, very soon at our league breakfast or our summer conference in Waite Park and St. Joe. Thanks so much. Have a great day.